People call Gen X independent, private, realistic, hard to impress, harder to shake. But a lot of what gets praised in Generation X was not born as confidence, it was born as adaptation. Gen X may be the only generation that learned one brutal lesson very early in life. If something goes wrong, no one is coming. And that changes a person. It changes how you trust, how you work, how you love, how visible you allow yourself to be, how much help you can receive without feeling ashamed. What looks like toughness on the outside can begin as something much sadder on the inside. Because some generations are shaped by abundance, some are shaped by opportunity, and some are shaped by absence. Gen X was shaped by absence. That may be why they are so rarely talked about in the same way as the generations around them. Boomers are framed as the old order. Millennials became the face of burnout and disillusionment. Gen Z gets studied almost like a cultural weather system, but Gen X sits in the middle like a structural beam no one really notices unless it starts to crack. And the strange thing is that invisibility almost fits them. They are not a generation that was trained to announce itself. They were not raised to narrate their pain in public. They were not taught that attention was a form of care. If anything, many of them learned the opposite. They learned early that being seen was not always safety. Sometimes it was exposure. Sometimes it was judgment. Sometimes it was one more place where you could be disappointed. So before we talk about why Gen X works the way it does, or why it distrusts performance, or why it seems so emotionally self-contained, we have to go back to the original scene. The house is empty. It is sometime in the late 70s. A kid lets themselves in after school. No phone in their pocket. No location sharing. No camera at the door. No quick text from a parent asking if they made it home. Just silence. Maybe there are chores. Maybe there is a snack. Maybe homework at the kitchen table. Maybe television humming in the background to make the room feel less hollow. And then waiting. That image matters more than people realize. Because an empty house does not just teach self-reliance. It teaches something deeper than skill. It teaches uncertainty about presence. It teaches a child that care may exist, but it is not guaranteed in the moment they need it. That support may come, but not now. That if something goes wrong, the first responder will probably be you. And when that lesson repeats often enough, it does not stay a memory. It becomes an operating system. This is where the psychology of Gen X begins. Not with rebellion, not with cynicism, not with cool detachment, with adaptation to emotional and practical distance. Albert Bandura spent much of his work describing self-efficacy, the belief that you can act on the world and handle what happens next. In its healthy form, that belief is empowering. It helps people face problems without collapsing. But there is a version of self-reliance that forms not from encouragement, but from necessity. That version is quieter, harder, less joyful. It says, I can handle it because I learned that I might have to. And there's a profound difference between those two sentences. One is strength. The other is strength built around the expectation of absence. That is why so much of Gen X can feel psychologically difficult to read. From the outside, they often appear composed, practical, unsurprised by hardship, not especially needy, not especially performative. But underneath that can be a very old calculation. Do not depend too much. Do not reveal too much. Do not expect too much. You will function better that way. And if you were raised in an environment where consequences were immediate, where adults were busy, where emotional explanation was not a cultural norm, that calculation starts to make sense. Many Gen X children grew up in homes where the rules were clear, but emotional buffering was not. You could make a mistake and feel the consequence quickly. There was not always a long therapeutic discussion afterward. Not always much space for processing, not always much curiosity about what the feeling underneath the behavior might have been. At the same time, the larger world around them was unstable in ways that cut deep. Adults preached order and permanence, but marriages broke. Jobs disappeared. Institutions lied. Trust was publicly fractured again and again. So now you have a child learning two things at once. Your actions matter, but the system itself is not reliable. That combination shapes a very specific kind of mind. You become careful but not fully trusting, capable but not fully relaxed, responsible but rarely innocent. You start thinking ahead, 3 steps ahead, sometimes. Not because you are naturally wiser than everyone else, not because you were born with superior judgment, but because unpredictability trained your nervous system to scan for what could go wrong before it happens. And this is where a lot of younger people misunderstand Gen X. They see realism and call it negativity. They see reserve and call it detachment. They see dry humor and call it emotional distance. But what they are often seeing is old pattern recognition. Carl Jung argued that what remains unconscious does not disappear. It keeps shaping behavior from underneath. And that is one way to understand Gen X. So much of what looks like personality in this generation is actually adaptation that became identity. The caution became wisdom. The distance became style. The irony became armor. The competence became selfhood. And once adaptation hardens into identity, it no longer feels like a response to something. It just feels like who you are. That may be why Gen X often does not describe itself in wounded language. Many people in this generation do not walk around saying, I learned hyper-independence because dependence felt dangerous. They say, I'm fine, I've got it, no big deal, I'll figure it out. And to be fair, they usually do. That is part of what makes this psychology so deceptively easy to admire. Because it works. It produces adults who can handle chaos, adults who can improvise, adults who do not panic easily, adults who do not need applause for doing what needs to be done. But functionality can hide cost. In fact, some of the most expensive psychological patterns are the ones that look impressive from the outside. There are wounds that make people collapse, and there are wounds that make people highly efficient. Gen X carries a lot of the second kind. That is why privacy matters so much to them. It is easy to reduce this to a simple cultural difference and say they just came from a pre-social media era. That is true, but it is not deep enough. Privacy was not just normal for Gen X. For many of them, privacy felt safe. They grew up in a world where your embarrassing moment did not become permanent public content. Your awkward phase did not become an archive. Your mistakes did not follow you through an algorithm. You could be messy in relative obscurity. You could fail privately. You could be unfinished without being documented. And when you come from that world, constant visibility does not feel like freedom. It feels risky. Because if your nervous system learned early that exposure can quickly become vulnerability, then of course you do not want to narrate your whole life to strangers. Of course you do not confuse broadcasting with connection. Of course you keep something back. For Gen X, invisibility was not always erasure. Sometimes it was protection. That protection also shows up in the way they work. One of the clearest psychological signatures of Gen X is that they do not place much faith in loyalty as an institution. They do not romanticize organizations. They do not assume the system will reward devotion forever. They saw too much instability for that. So instead of trusting structures, they learn to trust usefulness. Be the one who can do the thing. Be the one who can solve the problem. Be the one people cannot afford to lose. This is not just about ambition. It is about safety. If the company can betray you, then competence becomes your fallback. If the rules can change overnight, then skill feels more dependable than belonging. If systems are shaky, usefulness becomes identity. That is why so many Gen X adults do not perform work ethic. They embody it. They do not need a speech about hustle. They do not need a post about discipline. They often do not even need recognition. They just keep going. And again, this is where the psychology is more interesting than the stereotype. Because underneath that competence is not always confidence. Sometimes it is vigilance. Sometimes it is an old belief that if you are not useful, you are exposed. If you are not needed, you are vulnerable. If you cannot handle it yourself, you are in danger of disappointment. So the safest thing is to become capable, extremely capable. There's dignity in that. There is also loneliness in it. It also explains their complicated relationship with authority. Gen X does not automatically rebel against authority. That would be too simple. What they distrust is unearned authority, titles without substance, certainty without competence, institutional power that demands obedience but does not deserve respect. And why would they trust it easily? They grew up watching public failures, political failures, corporate failures, adult failures. They saw how often official did not mean wise, how often respectable did not mean honest, how often leadership arrived wearing the right costume and still had no idea what it was doing. So they developed a filter. Prove it. If you are good at what you do, they can respect you deeply. If you know your craft, they will often give you more loyalty than almost anyone. But if you hide behind status while lacking substance, they see through it fast. This is one reason Gen X can seem quietly hard to manipulate. They are not especially impressed by presentation alone. They came from a world where too many polished surfaces hid structural weakness. And once again, that is both a strength and a scar. Because the same psyche that resists empty authority also struggles to surrender, to trust fully, to let someone else carry weight without monitoring how they carry it. That is the paradox at the center of Gen X. They are one of the most self-reliant generations, and one of the most quietly collaborative. They may not ask for help easily, but they often help other people without making a production out of it. No announcement, no moral performance, no identity built around being seen as caring. They just show up. Why? Because when parents were absent, peers mattered. Friendship was not always ornamental. Sometimes it was infrastructure. Gen X learned how to form bonds in a horizontal world, not necessarily by making themselves emotionally transparent, but by being practically present. I may not tell you everything I feel, but if your car breaks down at midnight, I'll come. I may not narrate my inner life, yeah, but if you are in trouble, I know how to be useful. That style of care can look emotionally muted to people raised in more expressive cultures. But that does not mean it is shallow. In many cases, it is love translated into reliability. Still, even that has a cost. Because the people who are best at being there for others are often the worst at revealing when they themselves are unraveling. This is where the story gets more painful. The hidden cost of self-reliance is not just exhaustion, it is alienation from need. If you learn too early that you must function through difficulty, then needing support can start to feel humiliating. Not because you consciously believe support is bad, but because your body learned a long time ago that dependence is risky. And once that lesson sinks deep enough, it does not matter how much insight you have. You can understand your pattern and still feel resistance when someone tries to help. That is why many Gen X adults are incredibly good in a crisis and strangely uncomfortable in softness. Crisis makes sense. Crisis is procedural. Crisis asks for action. Softness is harder. Softness asks for receiving, for staying present without fixing, for allowing yourself to be seen before you have solved the problem, for admitting that competence is not the same thing as safety. And for people shaped by absence, that can feel more exposed than emergency itself. This is also why their humor matters. Gen X humor often has a certain dryness to it, a sideways wit, a little shrug in the face of absurdity. That is not just style, it is regulation. Humor creates distance. Irony reduces sting. If you can make the thing slightly ridiculous, you can survive it without letting it fully enter you. Viktor Frankl wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies freedom. For Gen X, irony often became that space, a way of pausing the emotional impact just enough to stay functional. But staying functional is not the same as staying whole. And that may be the deepest tragedy hidden inside so much Gen X competence. They were not taught to collapse, so they learned to continue. They were not taught to need gently, so they learned to need less. They were not taught to expect emotional presence, so they stopped building their lives around it. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable truth in this entire conversation. Gen X's independence is not just a virtue, it is often a scar that learned how to function well. That sentence matters because it reframes everything: the calm, the privacy, the low maintenance image, the practical intelligence, the emotional restraint, the skepticism, the anti performative work ethic. All of it can be read two ways: as admirable character, or as adaptation to a world that trained them not to assume they would be held. And maybe both are true, because the point is not to reduce Gen X to damage. That would be just as shallow as reducing them to grit. The point is to see the whole shape. Yes, this generation is capable. Yes, it can solve problems. Yes, it can handle ambiguity, boredom, friction, and delayed gratification better than many people alive today. But that does not mean the cost was small. Some wounds do not make people collapse. They make people competent, and competence is one of the easiest disguises suffering ever found. This becomes even more striking when you watch Gen X parent. Many of them gave their children what they did not receive: more attention, more emotional language, more supervision, more involvement, and yet underneath that generosity there can still be anxiety. A fear that too much softness creates fragility. A suspicion that constant visibility weakens the self. A worry that dependence, once normalized, will leave a person unready for the world as it really is. Why do they fear that? Because in the Gen X worldview, visibility and vulnerability are tangled together. Exposure does not automatically mean intimacy. Sometimes it just means exposure. And because they were shaped by a world in which boredom, solitude, and practical friction were normal, they know something newer generations often do not. That being alone with your thoughts is not always pathology. That boredom can strengthen attention. That not having an answer instantly can build character. That friction is not always failure. Gen X may be one of the last generations to remember what it felt like to live before the self became public content, before identity became performance, before every confusion needed an audience, before every mood needed a format. That does not make them morally superior. It makes them historically distinct. They were formed in a hinge moment, too late to belong fully to the old world, too early to be shaped cleanly by the new one. They are the bridge generation, and bridges live a strange life. They connect worlds that do not naturally meet. They hold weight from both directions. They are used constantly and admired rarely. People trust them with their movement, but seldom stop to wonder what that load does over time. That is Gen X, a generation suspended between analog and digital, between authority and skepticism, between stoicism and loneliness, between competence and the unspoken fatigue beneath competence. They hold, they carry, they continue. And maybe the most Gen X thing of all is that many of them do not even expect anyone to notice. But perhaps that is exactly what needs to be noticed. Not to romanticize them, not to crown them, not to turn them into a nostalgic myth of how people used to be tougher, but to finally name the pattern clearly. A person can become deeply impressive for reasons that were never gentle. A generation can become resilient because it was not allowed to be otherwise. And the traits the world praises most may sometime be the very places where tenderness went missing first. So maybe the defining feature of Gen X is not toughness. Maybe it is this: they learned early that tenderness was not always available. So they built lives around not needing too much of it. They did not just learn how to survive quietly, they learned how to make silence look like strength. And that leaves us with a deeper question, one that reaches far beyond one generation. What happens when self-reliance stops being a skill and becomes an identity? What happens when not needing anyone becomes the only way you know how to feel safe? At what point does strength stop being strength and become a wound so functional that nobody recognizes it? Because sometimes the hardest people to help are not the weakest ones. They are the ones who learned too early that needing help was dangerous. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, you may not just be hearing a generational profile. You may be hearing a survival pattern,